Welcome back. In this video, you'll understand clearly about an important topic called as factory bean. What is a factory bean? Let me explain you clearly. Normally, we configure beans like this. In this bean tag, how is an object created? By using a default constructor and then setters are called. But if you see this bean definition for JDBC transaction repository MPL, an object is constructed by calling an parameterized constructor. Here default constructor and here parameterized constructor. But let's say we have a special case. We want an object to be created by executing some logic. Then both of these configurations are not valid. So how to create an object by executing some logic? For supporting such scenarios, in Spring they gave something called as factory bean. So what is factory bean? Factory bean is an interface and you can write your own implementation of factory bean. But in the framework there are a lot of factory beans already. So let me explain you about a simple scenario and I'll show you how to create your own factory bean and what happens when you configure your own factory bean. So let me tell you about a simple requirement. Now what I want to do is I want to look up the JNDI. Hope you know what is Java naming and directory interface. I expect you to understand about what is JNDI. If not, you can just Google and find out what is JNDI. Okay, suppose if you want to look up for an object available in JNDI. So there will be something called as JNDI server which will be running inside your application server. JNDI server. Now what I want to do is I want to connect to this JNDI server through my application and I want to look up an object by giving a name. So if you have worked on JNDI, how to look up an object in JNDI? What we do is normally we write the configuration of how to connect to JNDI in JNDI.properties. So we write key value page on how to connect using JNDI.properties. Then what we do in our code, we create something like this initial context. There is an object called as initial context. Context is equals to new initial context and to the constructor will pass a properties object which has loaded this JNDI.properties. Then what? Then we'll say context dot lookup with whatever name you want to look up in the JNDI server. That's all. This will return you the object. Lookup method will return you the object which is available in JNDI. So that means in this case I want to get an object from the JNDI server and that should be defined as a bean. Assume that we have data source object available in JNDI. Now I want to look up a JNDI and get the data source as a bean in my Spring. How to do the same? Very simple. If you want to write your own, if you want to create a bean by executing your logic, then you have to write your factory bean. So I have written my own factory bean. If you have to write your own factory bean, you have to implement factory bean interface or you can extend abstract factory bean. Abstract factory bean is already implementing factory bean. Then you have to override your logic inside create instance. So here my JNDI object factory bean is dependent on, it requires what is the JNDI name with which it should look up the object and also the JNDI properties object. Okay. So if you see in create instance what I'm doing, I'm creating initial context by loading this JNDI.properties and I'm looking up an object which is bound with JNDI name and returning it. So if I have written class like this, let us see how I'm configuring this. Okay, see I have JNDI.properties in my class path and you know already util colon properties can be used to load any dot properties file into memory. So I have loaded jnd.properties. Writing util colon properties is equivalent to writing a bean of type java.util.properties, which has loaded this jndi.properties. Then what? I am configuring a bean of type my jndi factory bean, and I am injecting. It is dependent on what? Two things. One is the jndi properties and jndi name. Jndi name is a string. I gave some string name, and jndi property is of type properties. I injected it. Now tell me, if I say context.getBean data source, will I get an object of this class? No. The application context will identify this class as a special class, because application context will identify this class is implementing factorybean, and what it will do is, whenever it is creating an object for this bean definition, it will create an object of this class my jndi object factorybean, then call set jndi name, set jndi.properties, jndi properties, and then the application context will call create instance. Whatever object is returned by this create instance will be your bean object for this bean definition. So whenever it's a context.getBean, or whenever the application context is creating an object for this bean definition, what it will do? It will create an object of this class. It will identify this class is a factorybean, then inject all the dependencies. After all dependencies are injected, then it will call create instance method. Whatever is returned by this is a bean object for this bean definition. So I'll be getting an object which is stored in the JNDI. So this is a very practical example of a factorybean. Hope you understood it. Okay, so in Spring there are already a lot of factorybeans. There is a factorybean for embedded database. Generally, for testing purposes, we don't use a normal standalone database, we use a embedded database. What do I mean by embedded database? A database which can be started inside my JVM. I can call it as an embedded database. If you know, there are a lot of embedded databases like HSQL, H2, Derby, etc. So Spring supports creating a data source for in-memory databases. So there is already a class called as embedded database factorybean. Okay, I'll come back. Sorry. Okay, so I'll come back. If you see, there's a bean called as embedded database factorybean. So as you can assume, this is implementing factorybean. So can you guess what is the logic inside it? There will be a method called as create instance inside this class, because it's implementing factorybean interface, and here there will be a logic to start an in-memory database. Starting an in-memory database is nothing but creating an object of a class and then calling start method on it. So in the create instance method of this class, there will be logic to create an object of in-memory database and starting it. And for that in-memory database, a data source object is created and the data source is returned. That is the logic inside create instance method of embedded database factorybean. So that means if you configure this data source, if you configure this bean, then you will be getting a data source for an embedded database which is running inside your same JVM. Okay, empty database, does it mean anything for our application? Generally, when testing, we may want to populate that empty database with some dummy data for testing. So that's why it is dependent on database populator. Here is a database populator. This database populator is a class which can read some scripts files. We have to inject a list of scripts. If I have n number of scripts, I can inject a list of scripts here. Then this populator is injected here. Now, can you guess what is the logic inside create instance of this class? It is creating an object of the database related class like HSQLDB. If you want to use HSQLDB, there will be a corresponding Java class. This method is creating an object of corresponding Java class and calling start method. That means in-memory database is started. For that in-memory database, it will create a data source, and on that data source, this populator is executed, which will execute this script. That means a database is populated with dummy data. Then the create instance method is returning you the data source which is populated. So you can use that data source for testing. So in Spring there is already a predefined factory bean for starting an embedded database. So you may ask me, Spring is using which embedded database by default? By default it will use H2 database. If you want to use HSQL or Derby, you can just see inside this documentation of embedded database factory bean and how to configure this embedded database factory bean to use Derby or HSQL database. Hope you understood the importance of factory bean. And similarly, later in next module, like in AOP, we'll be using something called as proxy factory beans. Proxy factory beans will create a proxy. Don't worry about understanding this code. This is a proxy factory bean. It's extending abstract factory bean, and inside create instance method there is a logic which can create a proxy for a given target. So later in AOP we will be writing our own caching proxy factory bean as well. Just understand that this is how you can create your own factory beans. So there is no lab exercise for this factory bean. Understanding concept is important. Hope you understood the concept. If you didn't understand, just go through the video once again and make sure that you understand before you go to the next topic. See you in next video.